Tom Sawyer Abroad by Mark Twain. Chapter 1. Tom Seeks New Adventures. Do you reckon Tom Sawyer was satisfied after all them adventures? I mean, the adventures we had down the river, and the time we set the darky Jim free and Tom got shot in the leg. No, he wasn't. It only just poisoned him for more. That was all the effect it had. You see, when we three came back up the river in glory, as you might say, from that long travel, and the village received us with torchlight processions and speeches, and everybody hurrahed and shouted, it made us heroes. And that was what Tom Sawyer had always been a hankering to be. For a while he was satisfied. Everybody made much of him, and he tilted up his nose and stepped around the town as though he owned it. Some called him Tom Sawyer the Traveler, and that just swelled him up fit to bust. You see, he laid over me and Jim considerable because we only went down the river on a raft and came back by the steamboat. But Tom went by the steamboat both ways. The boys envied me and Jim a good deal, but land, they just knuckled to the dirt before Tom. Well, I don't know. Maybe he might have been satisfied if it hadn't been for old Nat Parsons, which was postmaster and powerful long and slim, and kind of good-hearted and silly and bald-headed on account of his age, and about the talkiest old critter I ever see. For as much as 30 years, he'd been the only man in the village that had a reputation. I mean, a reputation for being a traveler, and was mortal proud of it. And it was reckoned that in the course of that 30 years, he had told about that journey over 1,000,000 times and enjoyed it every time. And now comes along a boy not quite 15 and sets everybody admiring and gawking over his travels, and it just gave the poor old man the high strikes. It made him sick to listen to Tom and to hear the people say, my land, did you ever, my goodness sakes alive, and all such things. But he couldn't pull away from it, any more than a fly that's got its hind legs fast in the molasses. And always when Tom come to a rest, the poor old critter would chip in on his same old travels and work 'em for all they were worth, but they were pretty faded and didn't go for much, and it was pitiful to see. And then Tom would take another innings, and then the old man again, and so on for an hour and more, each trying to beat out the other. You see, Parsons' travels happened like this. When he first got to be postmaster and was green in the business, there come a letter for somebody he didn't know, and there wasn't any such person in the village. Well, he didn't know what to do nor how to act, and there the letter stayed and stayed week in and week out till the bare sight of it gave him a conniption. The postage wasn't paid on it, and that was another thing to worry about. There wasn't any way to collect that 10 cents, and he'd reckon the government would hold him responsible for it and maybe turn him out besides when they found he hadn't collected it. Well, at last he couldn't stand it any longer. He couldn't sleep nights. He couldn't eat. He was thinned down to a shatter. Yet he dasn't ask anybody's advice, for the very person he asked for advice might go back on him and let the government know about the letter. He had the letter buried under the floor, but that did no good. If he happened to see a person standing over the place, it'd give him the cold shivers, and loaded him up with suspicions, and he would sit up that night till the town was still and dark, and then he would sneak there and get it out and bury it in another place. Of course, people got to avoiding him and shaking their heads and whispering, 'cause the way he was looking and acting, they judged he had killed somebody or done something terrible. They didn't know what. And if he'd been a stranger, they'd have lynched him. Well, as I was saying, it got so he couldn't stand it any longer, so he made up his mind to pull out for Washington and just go to the President of the United States and make a clean breast of the whole thing, not keeping back an atom, and then fetch the letter out and lay it before the whole government and say, now there she is, do with me what you're a mind to, though as heaven's my judge I'm an innocent man, and not deserving of the full penalties of the law, and leaving behind me a family that must starve, and yet hadn't a thing to do with it, which is the whole truth, and I can swear to it. So he did it. He had a little wee bit of steamboating and some stage coaching, but all the rest of the way was horseback, and it took him 3 weeks to get to Washington. He saw lots of land and lots of villages and 4 cities. He was gone most 8 weeks, and there never was such a proud man in the village when he got back. His travels made him the greatest man in all that region, and the most talked about, and people came from as much as 30 miles back in the country and from over in the Illinois bottoms, too, just to look at him. And there they'd stand and gawk, and he'd gabble. You never see anything like it. Well, there wasn't any way to settle which was the greatest traveler. Some said it was Nat, some said it was Tom. Everybody allowed that Nat had seen the most longitude, but they had to give in that whatever Tom was short in longitude, he had made up for in latitude and climate. It was about a standoff, so both of them had to whoop up their dangerous adventures and try to get ahead that way. The bullet wound in Tom's leg was a tough thing for Nat Parsons to buck against, but he bucked the best he could, and at a disadvantage, too, for Tom didn't sit still as he'd ordered done, to be fair, but always got up and sauntered around and worked his limp while Nat was painting up the adventure that he had in Washington. For Tom never let go that limp when his leg got well, but practiced it nights at home and kept it good as new right along. Nat's adventure was like this. I don't know how true it is, maybe he got it out of a paper or somewhere, but I'll say this for him, he did know how to tell it. He could make anybody's flesh crawl, and he'd turn pale and hold his breath when he told it, and sometimes women and girls got so faint they couldn't stick it out. Well, it was this way, as near as I can remember. He came eloping into Washington and put up his horse and shoved out to the president's house with his letter. And they told him the president was up to the Capitol and just going to start out for Philadelphia, not a minute to lose if he wanted to catch him. Nat most dropped, it made him so sick. His horse was put up, and he didn't know what to do. But just then along comes a darky driving an old ramshackly hack, and he sees his chance. He rushes out and shouts, $50 if you get me to the Capitol in a half an hour, and a quarter extra if you do it in 20 minutes. Done, says the darky. Nat jumped in and slammed the door, and away they went a-ripping and a-tearing over the roughest road a body ever see, and the racket of it was something awful. Nat passed his arms through the loops and hung on for life and death, but pretty soon the hack hit a rock and flew up in the air, and the bottom fell out, and when it came down, Nat's feet was on the ground, and he was in the most desperate danger if he couldn't keep up with the hack. He was horrible scared, but he laid into his work for all he was worth and hung on tight to the arm loops and made his legs fairly fly. He yelled and shouted to the driver to stop, and so did the crowds along the street, for they could see his legs spinning along under the coach and his head and shoulders bobbing inside through the windows, and he was in awful danger. But the more they all shouted, the more the darky whooped and yelled and lashed the horses and shouted, "Don't you fret, I's a-gonna get you there in time, boss. I's gonna do it sho." For you see, he thought they were all hurrying him up, and of course he couldn't hear anything for the racket he was making, and so they went ripping along, and everybody just petrified to see it, and when they got to the Capitol at last, it was the quickest trip that ever was made, and everybody said so. The horse laid down, and Nat dropped all tuckered out, and he was all dust and rags and barefooted, but he was in time. And just in time, and caught the president and gave him the letter, and everything was all right, and the president gave him a free pardon on the spot, and Nat gave the darky 2 extra quarters instead of 1, because he could see that if he hadn't had the hack, he wouldn't have got there in time, nor anywhere near it. It was a powerful good adventure, and Tom Sawyer had to work his bullet wound mighty lively to hold his own against it. Well, by and by, Tom's glory got to paling down gradually on account of other things turning up for people to talk about. First a horse race, and on top of that a house afire, and on top of that a circus, and on top of that the eclipse. And that started a revival, same as it always does. And by that time there wasn't any more talk about Tom, so to speak, and you never see a person so sick and disgusted. Pretty soon he got to worrying and fretting right along day in and day out, and when I asked him what was he in such a state about, he said it most broke his heart to think how time was slipping away, and him getting older and older, and no wars breaking out, and no way of making a name for himself that he could see. Now that's the way boys is always thinking, but he was the first one I ever heard come out and say it. Chapter 2. The Balloon Ascension. Then the St. Louis papers begun to talk a good deal about the balloon that was going to sail to Europe, and Tom sort of thought he wanted to go down and see what it looked like, but couldn't make up his mind. But then the papers went on talking, and so he allowed that maybe if he didn't go, he might never have a chance to see a balloon. And next he found out that old Nat Parsons was going down to see it, and that decided him, of course. He wasn't going to have Nat Parsons coming back and bragging about seeing the balloon and him having to listen to it and keep quiet. So he wanted me and Jim to go too. So we went. It was a noble big balloon, and had wings and fans and all sorts of things, and wasn't like any balloon you see in pictures. It was way out toward the edge of town in a vacant lot, corner of 12th Street, and there was a big crowd around it making fun of it and making fun of the man, a lean, pale feller with that soft kind of moonlight in his eyes, and they kept saying it wouldn't go. It made him hot to hear them, and he would turn on them and shake his fist and say they was animals and blind, but someday they would find they had stood face to face with one of the men that lifts up nations and makes civilizations, and was too dull to know it. And right there on this spot, their own children and grandchildren would build a monument to him that would outlast 1,000 years, but his name would outlast the monument. And then the crowd would burst out in a laugh again and yell at him and ask him what his name was before he was married, and what he would take to not do it, and what his sister's cat's grandmother's name, and all the things that a crowd says when they've got hold of a fella that they see they can plague. Well, some things they said was funny, yes, and mighty witty too, I ain't denying that. But all the same, it weren't fair nor brave, all them people pitching in on one, and they so glib and sharp, and him without any gift of talk to answer back with. But good land, what did he want to sass back for? You see, it couldn't do him no good, and it was just nuts for them. They had him, but that was just his way. I reckon he couldn't help it. He was made so, I judge. He was a good enough sort of critter, and hadn't no harm in him, and was just a genius, as the paper said, which wasn't his fault. We can't all be sound, we've got to be the way we're made. And near as I can make out, geniuses think they know it all, and so they won't take people's advice, but always go their own way, which makes everybody forsake them and despise them, and that's perfectly natural. If they was humbler and listen and try to learn, it'd be better for 'em. The part the professor was in was like a boat, and it was big and roomy and had watertight lockers around the inside to keep all sorts of things in, and a body could sit on them and make beds on 'em too. We went aboard, and there was 20 people there, snooping around and examining, and old Nat Parsons was there too. The professor kept fussing around, getting ready, and the people went ashore, drifting out one at a time, and old Nat, he was the last. Of course, it wouldn't do to let him go out behind us. We mustn't budge till he was gone, so we could be last ourselves. But he was gone now, so it was time for us to follow. I heard a big shout, and turned around. The city was dropping from under us like a shot. It made me sick all through, I was so scared. Jim turned gray and couldn't say a word, and Tom didn't say nothing but looked excited. The city went on dropping down and down and down, but we didn't seem to be doing nothing but just hang in the air and stand still. The houses got smaller and smaller, and the city pulled itself together closer and closer, and the men in wagons got to looking like ants and bugs crawling around, and the streets like threads and cracks, and then it all kind of melted together, and there wasn't any city anymore. It was only a big scar on the earth, and it seemed to me a body could see up the river and down the river about 1,000 miles, though of course it wasn't so much. By and by, the earth was a ball, just a round ball of a dull color, with shiny stripes wriggling and winding around all over it, which was rivers. The widder Douglas always told me the earth was like a round ball, but I never took any stock in a lot of them superstition of hers, and of course I paid no attention to that one, because I could see myself that the world was the shape of a plate and flat. I used to go up on the hill and take a look around and prove it for myself, because I reckon the best way to get a sure thing on a fact is to go and examine it for yourself and not take anybody's say-so. But I had to give in now that the widder was right. That is, she was right as to the rest of the world, but she weren't right about our part of the village. That part is the shape of a plate and flat, I take my oath. The professor had been quiet all this time, as if he was asleep. But he broke loose now, and he was mighty bitter. He says something like this: "Idiots! They said it wouldn't go, and they wanted to examine it and spy around and get the secret of it out of me. But I beat 'em. Nobody knows the secret but me. Nobody knows what makes it move but me. And it's a new power. A new power. And 1,000 times the strongest in the earth. Steam's foolishness to it. They said I couldn't go to Europe. To Europe! Why, there's power aboard to last 5 years and feed for 3 months. They're fools. What do they know about it? Yes, and they said my airship was flimsy. Why, she's good for 50 years. I can sail the skies all my life if I want to, and steer where I please. Though they laughed at that and said I couldn't. Couldn't steer. Come here, boy, we'll see. You press these buttons as I tell you. He made Tom steer the ship all about in every which way, and learnt him the whole thing in nearly no time, and Tom said it was perfectly easy. He made him fetch the ship down most to the earth and had him spin her along so close to the Illinois prairies that a body could talk to the farmers and hear everything they said perfectly plain. And he flung out printed bills to them that told about the balloon and said it was going to Europe. Tom got so he could steer straight for a tree till he nearly got to it and then dart up and skim right over the top of it. Yes, and he showed Tom how to land her, and he done it first rate, too, and set her down in the prairies as soft as wool. But the minute we started to skip out, the professor says, "No, you don't," and shot her up in the air again. It was awful. I begun to beg, and so did Jim, but it only gave his temper a rise, and he began to rage around and look wild out of his eyes, and I was scared of him. Well, then he got on to his troubles again and mourned and grumbled about the way he was treated and couldn't seem to get over it, especially people saying his ship was flimsy. He scoffed at that and at their saying she weren't simple and would be always getting out of order. Get out of order. That graveled him. He said that she couldn't get any more out of order than the solar sister. He got worse and worse, and I never see a person take on so. It gave me the cold shivers to see him, and so it did Jim. By and by he got to yelling and screaming, and then he swore the world should never have his secret at all now it had treated him so mean. He said he would sail his balloon around the globe just to show what he could do, and then he would sink it in the sea and sink all of us along with it, too. Well, it was the awfulest fix to be in, and here was night coming on. He give us something to eat and made us go to the other end of the boat, and he laid down on a locker where you could boss all the works, and put his old pepperbox revolver under his head, and said if anybody came fooling around there trying to land her, he'd kill 'em. We sat scrunched up together and thought considerable, but didn't say much, only just a word once in a while when a body had to say something or bust. We were so scared and worried. We was pretty low down, and the moonshine made everything soft and purty, and the farmhouses looked snug and homeful, and we could hear the farm sounds and wished we could be down there, but laws, we just slipped along over them like a ghost and never left a track. Away in the night when all the sounds was late sounds, and the air had a late feel, and a late smell, too, about a 2 o'clock feel as near as I could make out, Tom said the professor was so quiet this time he must be asleep, and we'd better... "Better what?" I says in a whisper, and feeling sick all over because I knowed what he was thinking about. "Better slip back there in time and land the ship," he says. I says, "No, sir, don't you budge, Tom Sawyer." And Jim was kind of gasping. He was so scared. He says, "Oh, Moss Tom, don't. If you touches him, we's gone sure. I ain't gwine near him, not for nothing in this world. Moss Tom, he's plumb crazy." Tom whispers and says, "That's why we've got to do something. If he wasn't crazy, I wouldn't give shucks to be anywhere but here. You couldn't hire me to get out, if he was in his right mind. But it's no good politics sailing around like this with a person that's out of his head and saying he's going around the world and then drown us all. We've got to do something, I tell you, and do it before he wakes up." But it made us turn cold and creepy just to think of it, and we said we wouldn't budge. So Tom was for slipping back there by himself to see if he couldn't get at the steering gear and land the ship. We begged and begged him not to, but it warn't no use. So we got down on his hands and knees and begun to crawl an inch at a time, we a-holding our breath and watching. After he got to the middle of the boat, he crept slower than ever, and it did seem like years to me. But at last we see him get to the professor's head and sort of raise up soft and look a good spell in his face and listen. Then we see him begin to inch along again toward the professor's feet where the steering buttons was. Well, he got there all safe and was reaching slow and steady toward the buttons, but he knocked down something that made a noise, and we see him slump down flat and soft in the bottom and lay still. The professor stirred and says, "What's that?" But everybody kept dead still and quiet, and he begun to mutter and mumble and nestle like a person that's gonna wake up. And I thought I was gonna die. I was so worried and scared. And then a cloud slid over the moon, and I most cried. I was so glad. She buried herself deeper and deeper into the cloud, and it got so dark we couldn't see Tom. Then it began to sprinkle rain, and we could hear the professor fussing at his ropes and things and abusing the weather. We was afraid every minute he would touch Tom, and then we would be goners and no help. But Tom was already on his way back, and when we felt his hands on our knees, my breath stopped sudden, and my heart fell down amongst my other works, because I couldn't tell in the dark it might be the professor, which I thought it was. Dear, I was so glad to have him back that I was just as near happy as a person could be that was up in the air that way with a deranged man. You can't land a balloon in the dark, and so I hoped it would keep on raining, for I didn't want Tom to go meddling any more and make us so awful uncomfortable. Well, I got my wish. It drizzled and drizzled along the rest of the night, which wasn't long, though it did seem so, and at daybreak it cleared, and the world looked mighty soft and gray and purty, and the forests and fields so good to see again, and the horses and cattle standing sober and thinking. Next the sun come a-blazing up splendid, and then we began to feel rusty and stretchy, and first we knowed we was all asleep. End of part 1.